Cool. Well, thanks to those who are praying for Tim and Paul and I as we headed off last Sunday and spent Monday out at Cobbity on a leadership retreat. It was a great time to have some rest, some food, conversation together, and also time with God and significant blocks of time considering the ministries here at West Penno and praying for all here at the church. And we're really grateful for this church body, for the way we care for each other, for new people that come in. And also we're encouraged that God is at work in us. And we want to see that continue as He equips us to grow in our gifts, including those who are developing as leaders here at West Penno. And we want to make sure we're recognising and supporting God's work in many people here. We are going to have some more conversations here before we report back about the church vision for 2025 and with the deacons as well about the budget on Sunday the 2nd of February. Last week in the summer series, Tim reminded us of Jesus' invitation to learn from him and to find rest in Jesus. And I hope you've had good times of rest over this summer, Christmas, New Year period. Some of us are back to work, and I know some here have got extended leave or holidays ahead from work, and that's great. I do hope that together we all continue to learn from Jesus, and in the rhythms of life that we find what it means to just walk alongside him and work alongside him. As we look to a passage today, which was Speaker's Choice, why did I choose this passage? Mostly because I want us to continue to focus on Jesus, to learn from him. And this passage clearly presents something of his actions, his heart, his teaching, and a challenge for us. It's also a unique passage. It only appears in the Gospel of Luke, so not in the other synoptic Gospels or John. And in the context, it occurs just days before Jesus is leaving that Galilee region where he grew up and spent so much time and going to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is the location where the chapters from John 13 through to the end, or to Jesus' crucifixion, obviously, are based. And those chapters in John are what we're going to look at as a church from February through to Easter. So in a way, it sort of connects and fills in that space leading up to there. But beyond that connection with this upcoming preaching focus, the more I sat there with Jesus imaginatively around the table, eating from his word, learning, I was personally challenged by him. I was challenged in my heart and my focus to renew its attention and affection, that Jesus would redirect my motives and my actions for his kingdom's cause. And I humbly realise again that I need his power to overcome what's my natural self-centeredness and to be able to join him in his outward focus. Like most of us, like most of Jesus' teaching, this passage does unsettle us and challenge us in our comfort. It informs us about how we can live effectively in his kingdom. And while we don't always like the challenge, we do want to be equipped for his kingdom, don't we? We do want to have effect, joining his effect and power. So over the Christmas New Year week, I'm assuming we've enjoyed some meals with family and friends, and we count those as God's blessing as we sit together with those relationships, people that are close to us and with different festive foods and reasons to celebrate. However, I'm also conscious, and I think we are too, of those around the world who may not have those same opportunities because they don't have safe homes, they don't have stable families, they don't have the resources to gather festive foods. And we're reminded from Luke 14 that God does see all, and he sees particularly the poor, the homeless, the outsiders, and he invites them into the blessings of his kingdom. Just before this passage that Sharon read for us, at the end of Luke 13, Jesus has been teaching in that chapter about the kingdom of God. But his teaching is a threat to those in power because he doesn't accept the status quo, and they're quite happy with the status quo in their own power. At the end of chapter 13, some Pharisees came to warn Jesus away from Galilee where he was because of King Herod's desire to kill him. These Pharisees had access to Herod and would have seen the wrong that Herod was doing, but rather than being a prophetic voice to power, to evil power in the case of Herod, their solution was to see Jesus go away, and that might bring some peace. I'm going to read some verses there at the end of chapter 13 before we get into 14. From verse 31. At that time, some Pharisees came to Jesus and said to him, "Leave this place and go somewhere else. Herod wants to kill you." He replied, "Go tell that fox. I will keep on driving out demons and healing people today and tomorrow, and on the third day I'll reach my goal. In any case, I must press on today and tomorrow and the next day, for surely no prophet can die outside of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who sent you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" Such rich prophetic words from Jesus there. You can feel his heart for the people that were going to be rejecting him. There was both opposition in Galilee, but going away from Galilee down to Jerusalem wasn't going to a safe place. That was where the prophets had been killed before him, and Jesus knew what was going to happen in that place. His focus wasn't on welcome or safety that Jerusalem could bring to himself, but rather he longed to bring welcome and safety to its children. He longed to gather them in like a hen protects its chicks under its wings. He knows what's ahead for him. It wasn't going to be safety. But through that pathway of death, he was going to bring that salvation. He was going to bring that eternal security to people who were lost, to those who truly committed to the name of the Lord. Many would call on his name. Many would even say, as he rode into Jerusalem days later, "Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." But some of those same people would also say, "Crucify him." And yet his heart was for all these people. He was compelled by God's love that we've sung about today and that he was demonstrating in giving his life. Well, with that context, we turn to chapter 14. And I'll just ask if Caleb can put the verses up as we look at them and go through these. 14 verse 1. Here we see that one Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. We'll start with the context of that day of the week, the Sabbath. God had given it to the Jewish people as a time to stop their work, to focus on him, to enjoy time and connection with each other as well. They were to remember that they were rescued from slavery. They also had many rules that they were to live out to demonstrate their difference to the people around them and the people they'd been rescued from in Egypt. On the Sabbath, God's law forbid them travelling outside of their own village. It forbid them from cooking food that had to be done and prepared beforehand. And that made Sabbath hospitality challenging for those who wanted to follow the law, right? And that would have included this legalistic Pharisee, right? Very much valued the righteousness in the law. This particular Pharisee is described as prominent, or other versions describe him as a ruler of the Pharisees, which is there in the Greek. Now, although this was in Galilee, he may very well have been a member of the Sanhedrin and had connections to that council of the Pharisees and other teachers of the law in Jerusalem. Here he was inviting Jesus into his home. They would allow a conversation, not a private conversation, but an extended dialogue at least. A guest couldn't leave a meal as easily as you might leave a conversation out on the street, right? Now, for Jesus to go, there was also more social and political risk in sitting down with these religious leaders, because he knew it wasn't only Herod that was trying to kill him. He'd heard that these religious leaders were plotting to kill him. They wanted to find wrong or fault with him. And it's clear here at the end of verse 1 that he was being carefully watched. They were looking to see where he'd step out of line, what he'd say that might provide testimony for him to be tried. So it indicates to Jesus, to use that phrase from Sherlock Holmes, the game is afoot. He's going to step into the action and we'll see what happens. But why would Jesus have accepted this invitation? Well, we've seen at the end of chapter 13 that Pharisees had warned him that Herod was going to have him killed. And this could have been an opportunity to speak to a leader of the Pharisees who would have had Herod's ear, to advocate for Jesus and make things a bit safer for him and his followers. But we've already seen that Jesus is against appeasing Herod. He doesn't want to work with corrupt leaders. He wants to challenge them. And that includes these Pharisees, who many times Jesus has pointed out their hypocrisy, their corruption, despite the sacred task given to them and the teachers of the law. Jesus is following God's plans, God's purposes, and it's not in order to protect his own safety. In general, although dangers all around, he's motivated by bringing God's love and mercy to people, even though in the context of a meal here, it might have been a trap. So Jesus accepts the opportunity in order to challenge and teach these religious leaders as well as his own disciples. Although both groups often fail to see and act in ways that demonstrate God's kingdom, ways that Jesus was showing, Jesus hasn't given up on them. And he's also teaching us. In the first place, we see the priority of God's kingdom, God's plans, over personal safety or personal security. And that's a challenge. I know it was a challenge for us involved in missions in Central Asia and leading people in missions. But whether you're going or sending or supporting those in missions to a world that is unsafe, to a world that's sometimes hostile, valuing God's plans, God's kingdom over personal safety, right, where that's required, is a demonstration of Jesus' kingdom. But Jesus also has some other lessons to teach, which we'll see over the course of this passage and indeed over the meal that he was having. Presumably, before Jesus was sitting and eating there, a person with obvious sickness appeared. We see it in verse 2, where we read that he appeared right there in front of him. Just happened to appear right there at that time, in that place, with all these people around, right? This man had dropsy, which the symptoms of that was bloating from liquid or fluids gathering in your limbs, and he would have been seen as unclean in the eyes of Pharisees. He wasn't invited to eat at the table with them, but he was allowed into Jesus' presence there, perhaps in the court outside, or the court of this home. Perhaps there he was ushered in like bait in a trap. That man himself may have been brave or naive, or he may have been complicit to the plans of the Pharisees. We don't know. They would have seen him, perhaps those in power, as a tool or as bait, as someone who they could use to find fault. But that's not how Jesus saw him. Jesus saw him as a person in need, and he had compassion on him. Yes, Jesus acknowledged the trap. We can see that in his words, the trap regarding the law and Sabbath. He asked the Pharisees, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" He was conscious, okay, if I heal this person, I'm seen by some as breaking the law. What do you say? What do you think? He opened up the possibility for them to acknowledge that there was a trap or to say what they might think about this situation, but they remained silent. Well, Jesus showed his heart and God's. He took hold of the man, he healed him, and he sent him on his way. He saw the man, he saw his needs, he honoured him as a person, and he had compassion. He freed this man from his sickness and he freed this man from the trap, and he went on his way. Continues in verse 5. He asked them another question. "If one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out?" This hypothetical does raise some questions in the minds of those hearing, and indeed for us. Firstly, won't you act to protect your own? If it's your child or even your animal that has need, won't you then act on the Sabbath? But perhaps if it's someone else or someone else's property, then you would rather turn to the law. You would rather then note that you're pious and you wouldn't act on the Sabbath day. I note that it's natural to protect yourself and your own family and property. However, it's godly to extend your resources and care far beyond yourself and those who are close to you, to those who are outside, to those who are marginalised. And the law can be used as a valid justification to ignore people who are outsiders. Oh, those people, they wouldn't come to church because of the way they're living, right? We're here in God's presence. They are outside of God's presence. What's our attitude to those who are outsiders? How does that conflict with our heart to be righteous followers of Jesus? And I guess the second question is, if mercy and law conflict, and sometimes they do, won't you choose mercy? Jesus did. And it's a challenge to us. And it's one we're going to pick up here in more detail during May Missions Month as we consider our mission to those who are marginalised around the world and the parts that we're already playing and maybe parts that we're called to play in God's acts of mercy. Well, in verse 6 as well, in response to this question and its challenge to them, the hosts, the guests, had nothing to say. There was no affirmation of this amazing healing that they'd seen or of God's mercy or God's power. They didn't even put up a vocal defence of the Sabbath law. Jesus, in a way, had addressed that by highlighting that the law might, in their case, have been a matter of self-justification rather than of real righteous living or living God's way. And I think that their own pride put up barriers to them being willing to humble themselves and give an answer, because that answer might have meant actually asking Jesus as teacher to heal their hearts, recognising that they had wrong motives and that they needed a work of God in their hearts to direct them in his way. But they didn't want to be challenged, so they shut their hearts and they shut their mouths. What's our posture before Jesus? We need to keep our hearts open to him. And sometimes that's humbling because we have to realise what's in our heart needs his work of renovation, rejuvenation, needs his deep work. We'll continue from verse 7. What do the Pharisees and other guests pay attention to? They pay attention, rather, to where they sit. The pride, the self-seeking that's evident in their silence also seems evident in their behaviour. in this case with regards to taking seats of honour around the table. Jesus doesn't directly point out these guests' prideful behaviour at this Sabbath meal, but rather he addresses it in what Luke calls a parable here in the end of verse 7. And this parable is set in the context of a more public meal, a great wedding feast. It's a simple story of people who have to make or take humiliating steps from a more honoured position at that one of those tables to a least position. And that seems to be followed by advice that the guest could rather be honoured by the host if they'd taken the more humble posture first. Now, in the context of the Sabbath meal where they were sitting with Jesus here, this time they had just seen an outsider healed by Jesus. This is someone who was not honoured and was not recognised by the Pharisees and his religious guests. And Jesus is demonstrating a different approach to God's kingdom. Being a parable, the readers of Luke's Gospel would also look for a broader meaning. They were seeing non-Jews become Christians as well. We can see this, I think, if you go on to verses 10 and 11. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled. Those who humble themselves will be exalted. Here, people are encouraged to think of those who are outside, who might be humble in themselves, but would then be moved up and honoured. And in the context of Luke 14, we see that these include people who are outsiders. We won't go into more detail later in this passage, but Jesus tells another story where those are brought in from outside. But here we can see, when in the following verses, if you continue, that Jesus gives the instructions to the host from verse 12, and you can see it there in verse 13 as well. When you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. These are people that weren't invited to that original situation, but these outsiders are encouraged to be ushered in. In the time of those reading Luke's Gospel, they were seeing many non-Jews, those who were formerly unclean, brought in to the kingdom of God, to the church, right? They were the chosen people. They were people that God had made a clean people, even as they went through various ceremonies like the Passover to remind them of what God had done. To bring others in, that was a challenge to them. They missed something of the wideness of God's mercy and love. And that's what Jesus is demonstrating, God's mercy, God's love. We don't give so that we can receive from others in a trade. Caleb, if you go on to the next section. Oh, you don't have... Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I'd given verses 12 to 14. My apologies. Well, then let me just read from verse 13 again and 14. When you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, Jesus said, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. So here, Jesus is encouraging, when you invite these people, they're not going to be able to repay you, right? We give to those who can't invite us back. They might not have a home. They might not be able to have the resources. But we're not looking for a reward from people. We're not looking for a reward from people, but only from God. And that's because by receiving God's grace and letting that be enough, we're demonstrating his kingdom and will be invited to continue in relationship with God. And here at West Penno, I think we do really well in responding to requests that come from hands and feet. At times when we have Christmas hampers that we need to fill, The hallway tables get filled with things that people buy and want to contribute to those who aren't going to give us something back, right? They get to enjoy fellowship because we help that to happen, and filling the non-perishables that can be added to the food that's distributed each week. I think that's great that we have that heart to give. We also support missionaries who we send out from here in their efforts to meet the spiritual needs of those that we'll never meet, those who won't be able to thank us in person or have us into their homes, as it were. We know Jesus' heart for those who are lost or don't have their own resources. And that's a challenge for us too. Thinking of such people and when you can help someone who maybe can't help you back, I'm reminded of the story that we've all seen in the news, I think, of Hadi Nazari, who was lost for 13 days in the Kosciuszko National Park. And he was sustained by the 2 muesli bars that someone had left in an isolated hut, right, in the mountains. Now, that person who'd left it wasn't leaving it in order, or could have saved it for themselves. They might have had need of it later. They could have given it as a trade for something else. But they left it without knowing that act was going to be a powerful act of mercy for someone in need. And Jesus, he does explain to people that when you give a luncheon, don't invite your friends or brothers or sisters or relatives. If you do, they may invite you back and you'll be repaid. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't have meals with close ones, of course. In fact, Jesus is encouraging generous hospitality. It's part of the context here, and he is saying when you give a luncheon, when you have this kind of meal. But he's wanting them to extend their hospitality. And those religious leaders needed the challenge so that more than the in-group would be at their table, because they were so ready to invite their people, right? Their people from their neighbours or their other Pharisees, their synagogue, to sit with them. But to have those who were outside, that would have been a challenge to them. It would have been difficult words for them to swallow, if you can pardon the pun. How can they, or who can naturally extend their resources and heart beyond their compatriots, beyond their family, right? It's harder to do. What's an application for us? Jesus' followers should value the invitation to his kingdom, that invitation that we've all received, so highly that we're happy to receive other things that he's given us. Because ultimately, every gift that we have, everything we own, is from him. We're happy to share that with others, including those who are overlooked, those that we may not see, because we want all people to have that opportunity to see Jesus' love, to experience his mercy, to enter his kingdom, to become part of our eternal family that is so wide that includes people from every tribe and language and nation, every marginalised subgroup. That's worth going out of our comfort zone for, right? That motivates us to go out in mission. But even those of us who can't go out are still called to embrace the wideness of God's mercy for all people, including those who aren't in our regular circles. What about brothers and sisters overseas who can't meet and eat at Jesus' table together because of poverty or because of regulations? I can give a practical example that we became aware of last year. In Rwanda, where last year around 8,000 churches were closed in that country by the government. Now, the political environment's complex, but the main reasons that these churches were closed are very simple. Firstly, that the church buildings needed to be upgraded to meet building codes for both safety and also for the planning regulations where they were in Rwanda. And secondly, that every church leader needed to have a recognised certificate or diploma from a Bible school, and those who were in leadership in an area supporting a number of churches needed at least a bachelor's degree. And we're in contact with some of these local believers that are supporting churches in the Nkurunziza network of churches that have a brethren church background there. And last year, 156 of the 168 churches there in that network were closed. 156 of the 168 were closed. And the thousands of believers that used to gather in these churches have no local church in walking distance to go to, right? Or they at least will have to make major changes to find a church. Now, later, even as part of our church vision and partnership with those who are marginalised around the world, we're going to present a plan for how we can partner with some of these believers in places such as Rwanda and some of those specific churches too, so that they can gather once again for teaching, for fellowship, to gather around the Lord's table with other believers on a Sunday. And that's because we want us all to have a broader heart, or just to have God's heart, right? And ways that we can participate in that. The passage in, or the passage indeed, the conversation around the table in Luke 14 continues, and Jesus tells a parable about a wedding feast where the people originally invited didn't come, and the owner of the house, the host of that wedding feast, then sent out his servant saying, "Go to the streets and alleys of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind and the lame." And then when they came in, there was still more room, and the master told the servant, "Go out into the roads and the country lanes, go outside of our village and compel them to come in, so that my house will be full." Now, we didn't need the extra message from Jesus, right? The people at the table did, to get the message, hey, God wants to invite more people in. Don't be limited. But it's there. And that's the challenge that Jesus presented, and that's the challenge he continues to give to us. So as we conclude, let me just simply ask 3 questions for our reflection. Firstly, why is this story and parable included here in Luke? And I want to suggest that it's at least partly to challenge and teach us through the example and words of Jesus. Well, what's he teaching us? What's he asking from us as disciples? He's asking us to not put ourselves first, but to see those who are marginalised, who are outside, and to invite them into God's family too. What's the challenge for me personally? What's the challenge for you personally? I'm going to leave you to answer that question. Maybe just reflect for a moment, and then Don's going to come and lead us in the final song and prayer.